Opportunity to talk to everyone about pets and food safety on agritourism operations. When Judy reached out to me with this title, I thought it was very interesting. And so I tried to pull together slides that I think will be at least introduce conversational topics that we can then take into the Q&A. I will tell you that Judy told me not to over-present, and she told me to leave a lot of time for questions and answers. So I'm going to try and stick to that plan and as we go. She also told me that she likes to keep questions and answers till the end. I don't care. I have the chat box open. If you want to put questions in, we can do that as well. But I know Lindsay will quit the recording and we can have that time to just talk about questions and answers. So in putting this together, I was not sure who would be on the call. So I'm asking you to share a bit about your operation. So if you can, in the chat box, put just the letters that apply to you, this would be great, or that describe your farm. So I don't sell any fresh produce. I sell fresh produce direct to consumers, would be B. I sell fresh produce wholesale, which would be C. My farm has a third-party audit every year, which is D, or my farm is legally subject to the FSMA PSR, which is E, or F, I don't know what FSMA PSR is or if I'm subject to that. So I'm going to sit here for just a moment and let people weigh in there. And you can put more than one. So if you sell produce direct to consumers and you think you're legally subject to the rule, you can put 2. Or if you sell produce but you don't know if you're legally subject, you can put F. Okay. Oh, good. There we go. Thank you. For those of you that don't sell any fresh produce, are you working with growers and that's why you don't sell? Or does your agritourism just not sell produce? Oh, you're a seed company. There you go. Okay, super. So if anybody wants to put any other information in there, that will help. So I'm going to assume there's some people in here that are working with growers in extension or something. And hopefully this will, okay. Oh, great. Fiber farmer. Super. Super. Okay, cool. Thank you, everyone. I appreciate those answers, Megan, Andrea, and Susan. That's great. And hopefully this will still be interesting. Okay, so I threw this in there because as director of the Produce Safety Alliance, we had somebody say, I'm not sure if I'm subject to the rule. So I did want to highlight very quickly that there is a decision tree created by the FDA that you can walk through that will tell you whether or not you're subject to the rule. The only thing that is going to have to be updated in here is understanding that some of the monetary limits are adjusted for inflation. So you're going to have to maybe pop out to see what those new numbers are. But I did just want to highlight that. I will put this resource again at the end of the presentation, just so that you can know there is a way to easily determine if you are legally subject to the rule. I wanted to start this by talking about bigger picture issues when we talk about pets at agritourism operations. So first of all, there's the issue of liability, and not my area of expertise, but I do want to mention it because it does come up. If you have people at your farm and if you have animals that are there that you let on, you're going to have liability from injuries that result from bites or diseases that the animals may be carrying. If you let folks bring their own pets, you may have conflict between animals. So somebody brings one dog, somebody brings another dog, the dogs don't get along. There are also microbial contamination issues, which is the area of expertise I spend most of my time on. The other thing I wanted to mention is customer comfort. Some people have a fear of animals or have been bitten by dogs. I myself personally have been bitten by 2 dogs. I've owned a dog. I like dogs, but I will tell you, I do not approach dogs I don't know without caution. Once you've been bitten multiple times, or even once, you are very hesitant about animals that do not belong to you. And then we move to what we're going to talk about mostly today, which is food safety. And there is this liability of the microbial contamination that I mentioned under liability, but there's also buyer requirements and regulatory requirements. Now, based on what you all responded, most of you, I don't think, are going to fall into the category of having third-party audits or dealing with buyers. But some of you might be legally subject to the regulatory requirements. So I'll try and highlight them. I did not put this presentation together as a regulatory presentation. So I'll just sort of touch on things as we go. But I did specifically pick this picture of a raccoon for a reason. And I wanted to share that story with you to highlight a few things. There was a grower, a U-pick grower, that told me once that he had a sign at his U-pick that said no dogs. And two customers came to this U-pick, and they each had a raccoon perched on their shoulder. And when they tried to enter the U-pick, he pointed to the sign that said no dogs, and they said, well, that says dogs. These aren't dogs. These are our pet raccoons. And so he sort of had a discussion with them, and when things sort of got loud, he decided he wasn't going to fight it, and he let them into the U-pick. And after they were done picking, he told me, and I quote, their butts weren't in the car 30 seconds, and that sign said no pets, not no dogs. So that's the first thing I want to share with you is when we talk about pets, what some people consider pets and what other people consider pets are sometimes maybe not the same thing. And you have to be aware of that when you're working with the public. The primary concern with animals in general, and I'm gonna go very, again, high level, animals, are that animals can carry human pathogens. When we think about E. coli 157H7, Salmonella, Listeria, and many other pathogens, animals can carry them. And they can spread these pathogens mostly by depositing feces in the field or spreading that fecal contamination as they move, or spreading that fecal contamination to human hands that then touch produce or food contact surfaces. You can see here my focus on feces. Are there other risks from, say, saliva and bodies and stuff like that? Yeah, you can definitely get pathogens that are surface contaminants in certain animals. But mostly we're talking about their feces. But just from the scientific perspective, I don't want you to believe you can't get pathogens from other parts of an animal, but mostly we're talking about the feces. And when we talk about animals on the farm, again, Judy tasked me with pets, but this issue of pets, I specifically put this picture of a ferret on here because there's different kinds of pets. There's pets that are the farm pets. They're the pets owned by the farm, the dogs, the cats. In the case of service animals, could be horses. So those are both pets, but now they're also working animals. There's service animals. That could be a service animal for somebody on the farm. We're going to talk about what actually is a service animal, but they mostly would come from customers likely coming to the farm. There's also working animals that are planting, but there's working animals that can be part of the entertainment. And then there's livestock, and livestock, create sellable resources such as eggs or meat, or in the case of ferrets, I've known farms that breed ferrets for pets. And sometimes livestock might be only for your personal use. Maybe you have a cow or two, or maybe you have a few chickens for eggs for your own family. And then there's wildlife, which is all around us. And as I showed you in the first picture, when you think about a raccoon, I think about raccoons as being wildlife, but some people think of them as being pets. This picture of a ferret, again, I know people that have raised ferrets. I will tell you, I was at a Wegmans Stopped at a Wegmans on a trip. I think we were in Virginia at the time. My family was there. We were stopping in to grab some groceries, and a guy was at the Wegmans hot bar with a ferret on his shoulder. So again, you see these animals oftentimes as pets. And so that's why when I was tasked with pets, it opens up all the animals in my mind. I am going to say a little bit about wildlife because they in agritourism on farmland are a natural part of the environment. And in fact, most customers love to come out to the farm and see wildlife. They feel like farms should be wild areas. Wildlife can be resident or transient. You can have birds that are migrating. You can have animals that are there. Certainly, I've been watching a buck in our own field, a beautiful buck. But when it comes time for mating, he may leave the field and go where there's more interesting does, right? So sometimes they're there for a while and sometimes they move on. Wildlife in close proximity to human activities can pose greater risk because they can transmit disease if they interface with livestock on your farm. Or you can have animals. I live in Geneva, New York, between two large dumps or landfills. And I have seen a white cabbage field, and it's not white because it's white cabbage. It's white from the seagulls leaving the dump and defecating on the field. And depending on the species, management options can really vary by state, county, or federal law. You obviously can't shoot or get rid of endangered species. You can sometimes get nuisance permits for some pests, but it really opens up a challenge for a lot of farms. I specifically wanted to talk about wildlife because of this issue of co-management. And there's one bullet in here that is really specific to New York farms that I wanted to talk about. So co-management considers both food safety and conservation of natural resources. Many farms have conservation contracts. I know our farm has had conservation contracts over time. And when you're trying to implement food safety and implement those conservation contracts, sometimes you might come up against things that are difficult to manage in both arenas. Growers have to be committed to food safety if you're selling fresh produce because you don't want to make people sick. You have to meet those regulatory requirements. If you're subject to FSMA, you have to meet those buyer requirements to keep the market. But if you're in New York, there's a program called New York Grown and Certified. And that is really where they're tasking you with balancing both conservation and food safety. And that is a program that many New York growers like to participate in. And so I wanted to talk about this co-management because that is an option. And growers may have their own stewardship, aesthetic, and business objectives when it comes to co-management, right? Growers often consider themselves stewards of the land, and they have their own goals with managing their farmland. Okay, so I'm going to go quickly through all of these types of animals just to talk about that overlap with pets. When we talk about livestock, mostly what we want to be concerned about is aware of the manure and its proximity to fresh produce. You want to think about the impact of water and air movement, right? So if you've got fresh produce or you've got a U-pick in your agritourism operation and you've got animals, where are the animals in relationship to those U-pick fields? And what happens when there's a lot of rain? What happens when you're cleaning stalls? What happens in terms of air movement if you're in a very windy area? We do know that pathogens can move in the air off of the research is really done in feedlots. But if you have a dusty place where the animals are held, that wind can blow dust that does have pathogens on it. So you want to consider things like berms, windbreaks, making sure that you don't have water running off from animal operations into fields. You also want to consider the movement of people and farm vehicles. Again, when you're talking about agritourism, where are these people going and how are they moving around the farm, especially if there's animals and produce involved. I always talk about, well, I'm going to talk about this when it comes to petting zoos, but the other thing is talking about dedicated equipment, and a process for cleaning and sanitizing equipment. So if you have equipment that is dedicated to animals, you can keep that equipment, use it only in your animal operations. But if you have equipment that is going between an animal operation and a fruit and vegetable field, then you want to talk about how do I clean and sanitize so I'm not bringing contamination from the animals over into the fresh produce. And then for personnel, how do you minimize the cross-contamination risks? And that really comes down to training and teaching and making sure people have the tools and the knowledge to reduce those risks. When we talk about working animals, risk can be minimized by not allowing working animals in the field when the harvestable portion is present. Sometimes that's not possible, especially if you're using the horses also when you want to pull the harvest wagon through. So things like establishing paths to minimize contact with produce, outlining a plan if an animal defecates near or on produce. The rule is the produce safety rule, the FSMA produce safety rule is very focused on not harvesting produce that has fecal contamination on it. Sounds pretty simple, but if you've ever seen a lot of people pick apples off the top of a tree, right? You're not looking at every side of the apple if there's been birds out there. So how do you minimize the harvest of things like bird poop on apples and other things? Again, personnel working with animals should understand the risks and minimize them. This is really talking about hand washing, practices to complete after handling animals, dedicated tools again, dedicated clothing, boots and overalls, and then of course cleaning and sanitizing steps for tools and clothing. You'll notice the repeat of some of these things in terms of hand washing and cleaning and sanitizing. Good ways to minimize risk is to keep fecal contamination off of food contact surfaces, including hands and tools. Sorry. Petting zoos. Do not allow the public to eat or drink around animals. And part of this is focused on, right, if you've touched an animal and then you're touching food and feeding yourself, that's where that contamination or cross-contamination is going to have. Again, animals can carry human pathogens, even if they look and act healthy, right? They've done studies in, I believe it was cow herds, and the cow herd can have E. coli 157H7, and it takes a while for it to impact the productivity of the herd. That's a really old publication. I can't remember who it's by, but the point is they can have contamination, they can be spreading or shedding, and they may not act sick or look sick. It may take a while for that to really become obvious. Visitors do not need to avoid contact with animals, but they should be aware of the risks and take steps to protect themselves. One of the things I love to talk about in petting zoos situations is unidirectional flow. So you come into the petting zoo in one spot, you move through and you exit in another spot. And at the exit, there's a hand washing station or 2 or 3 so that everybody can do it. I know I have said out loud, and I'll say it again, the best use of a minimum wage summer worker would be to put them at that exit and to make sure everybody washes their hands upon exiting the exhibit, right? Because then you're going to reduce the risk that you're going to get contamination of fresh produce if they move to a different part of your operation. The one thing I do want to mention is I know years ago, and I don't know if this has changed because I don't visit every county in New York every year, but some counties in New York do not allow direct contact with animals at a petting zoo. So as you can see here, here people are feeding these goats. Some operations, you're not allowed to have contact with the animals at a petting zoo. So make sure you're following your county regulations. There's lots that can be done to make exhibits still interesting. My favorite is, the feeding the goats out of a soup can that you put the feed in and you move it up with a rope to the goats. Lots of ways to still have an engaging animal exhibit without contact. But I do want to mention that. The other thing I wanted to mention about petting zoos is if you have a petting zoo and you're subject to the regulation, you must have hand washing sinks available and you have to make visitors aware of policies. This falls under the visitor requirement in the produce safety rule, right? There's always two things you have to tell visitors. Where are the toilets and the hand washing sinks, and what are my policies? And so the question becomes, how do you share that information, right? You can have signage outlining risks associated with contacting animals. You can have personnel, as I mentioned, monitoring the petting zoo area, monitoring to make sure people are washing their hands. And again, that single directional flow, those are really solid things you can do to reduce risks and keep the exhibit interesting, right? That single flow not only is good for the hand washing, but it's great for the people walking through the operation because it keeps things spread out. It keeps people going in the same direction. It makes things less crowded. If we learned anything from COVID, it's that people don't like to be crowded and rushed through farms. A lot of farms after COVID told me when they were only allowed so many people, it was great to have a farm stand that had people all day long, as opposed to 50 or 60 people at one time and then no people at other times, right? So part of managing an agritourism operation is managing that experience. And I think single flow also does that. Service animals, very, very important. The Americans with Disabilities Act defines a working service animal as a dog or a miniature pony that has been individually trained to perform tasks for a person with a disability. A service animal is not required to wear a vest or other identification, and it must be under the control of a handler. But you can see here that a service animal, really only a dog or a pony. So if somebody shows up with their um, service animal raccoon, it's not a service animal. You have to have appropriate signage on farm for pet relief areas and other food safety policies that impact service animals. ADA regulations do not cover comfort or emotional support animals. So those are not covered under the Americans with Disabilities Act. Pets. Getting to the title of the thing, but I want you to understand all those animals we've talked about, livestock, petting zoos, those can also be considered certainly farm pets. Pets are often difficult to manage because they're viewed as family members, both by the farmer and by the customer, right? People's dogs, um, they are family members. Um, they should be excluded from produce fields and packing houses. I will tell you, you can have working animals, you can have service animals. We've talked about that. But if you want to minimize risk, keeping the animals out of the field is the best way to do that. This last bullet, we're working on version 2 of the PSA grower training curriculum. And I just want to be very clear about this last bullet. The recommendation, which is the should, I think the farm policy should tell customers that they must not bring their pets to the farm. That's my personal recommendation. That is not a regulatory requirement. I want to make that very clear. That's my personal recommendation. Because of the liability of animals fighting one another, animals carrying disease, animals defecating in the field, I think you'd be best off to tell people to leave their pets at home. I know farms that are not willing to do that because they want to attract those customers that have the dogs, and that's fine. So I just want to make it clear, not a regulatory requirement. That is really just a recommendation based on what I see as those risks. You can tell them to leave their animals at home with the exception of service animals. You can't tell people they can't bring service animals with them. So what are the decisions you need to make? You need to decide, will I allow my pets on the farm? Am I going to have pets on the farm that I'm going to allow to be in the field, to be riding around with me? Been on a lot of farms, and I'm going to say most farmers say, yep, I'm going to have pets because I see a lot of pets. Will I allow customers to have pets on my farm? I have to consider ADA service animals are a likely thing that is going to show up in my farm operation and in my agritourism operation, but am I going to let them bring other pets to the farm besides service animals? How can I effectively assess and manage risks? So I know I'm going to have service animals. I should have a policy for dealing with service animals for sure. I should have a policy for that. What am I going to do about other pets? What is my policy going to be? What are going to be relief areas? If I have a petting zoo, how am I going to set that up to minimize my risks? We talked about things you can do to minimize risks. What resources will I need? Do I need to brush up on ADA? Do I need to get some posters? Georgia and Rutgers have really good publications. I should have thrown those in here. I did not. Rutgers and Georgia have nice publications about service animals, very helpful. And then how do I communicate my decisions to my employees and to my customers? These are both critical things, right? Because if you say no pets, somebody's going to show up with a pet. So how do you deal with that? How do you train your employees to deal with that? Do you allow an area where people can tie their pets up, like people used to tie their horses up so they don't have to stay in a warm car or something like that? How are you going to manage that if people show up on a hot day with a dog and they want to come and they're willing to put their animal somewhere else? I don't even know how I would manage that in my own operation, but think about those things because you need to convey that to your employees as well as your customers. This is from our More Than Words collection of illustrations. And you can see here, this is just aimed at helping people understand when they come to your operation what to expect. As I mentioned, the produce safety rule requires you tell visitors two things: where the toilet and hand washing facilities, as you can see in this poster, and what are your policies. And you can see here that this grower is pointing out some of the policies they have about restrooms, trash, washing your hands, not allowing pets, and you pick containers. How you convey this information is up to you. You have to share the policy. It doesn't tell you how you have to share the policy, right? I also wanted to share record keeping if you are subject to the rule. There's probably 2 record keeping sheets that are required that would be very relevant to your operation as an agritourism. One would be the worker training record, and the other would be the cleaning and sanitizing record. We have a required records document if you are subject to the PSR, or even if you're not, and you want to keep track of all the stuff you've done to protect your farm. I'll show you coming up. There's a resources list from the Produce Safety Alliance, our website. You can get it there, but did want to share these with you. So in summary, and again, I kept this short because she told me I should leave half the time for questions. Animals, including pets, bring several different risks to an agritourism operation. Food safety risks are mostly from fecal contamination resulting from animal poop, their movement, or the cross-contamination from humans that interact with them. Actions to minimize risk should focus on preventing animal presence. That goes for everything: wildlife, livestock, all of that, pets, and reducing the spread of fecal contamination. Again, fecal contamination is not the only risk, but it is the predominant risk. This includes things like policy development, hand washing stations, and training. Training is so very important to the success of your operation. It is amazing to me every time we talk about training that people don't think it works and how well it actually works. So good training is really the front lines of defense in terms of creating an operation that gets everything you want done day in and day out without having to feel like you're running around trying to get people to do the right thing. Training people is a really solid investment of time and money. The other thing that's a solid investment is good communication and monitoring to make sure the practices you've put into place are actually reducing risks. And customers like a well-organized operation. Customers like to come into an operation where they know what is expected, where they know what the policies are. I don't think I'm sure there are people that are tolerant of craziness, but again, one of the things we really learned from COVID was that communication is very meaningful to people, and people like to have a great experience. They don't like to be rushed through operations. They like to feel like they can come and look around and not be in a group where they get pushed around and they don't get that individual time after they've taken the effort to get to the farm and to come for that experience. I did want to mention this because this is going on right now. If produce safety is part of your life, if you're managing your farm, if you're trying to figure out what you're doing, we are piloting right now a produce safety certificate program. And it's basically, you're going to get it for free. It's a new program. You're going to be asked as a pilot to evaluate the courses you take, to participate in a focus group, to give us feedback, to determine if we should launch it as is or if we should change it. We anticipate it will take about 37 hours to complete. We're looking for people to complete the courses by the end of October. There may be some wiggle room because some of the courses are launching right now. If you're interested, please email me. I'm hoping to get 25 people in the pilot, and I think we have 19 right now. So if you're interested, just let me know. It is a mix of 6 self-paced courses, or there's a couple that will be in person. There's a couple that are remote, and then you'll have to take a yearly update webinar to just keep the certificate valid. You can see here the courses: an introduction to microbiology, the PSA grower training, the GMPs course, part 117. We have a FSMA overview course, a food safety continuum course that talks about moving from a field to a packing house, to a product where you might want to use HACCP, such as a canned product. So if you're doing value added, there's going to be a sanitation workshop, and then, of course, the annual update webinar. Again, if you're interested in that, please let me know, and we can get you information, and you can decide if you want to register for that. Here's some resources. There's the resource for New York Grown and Certified. If you're not familiar with that program, I think you should take a look at it. The Produce Safety Alliance. There's the More Than Words link, and then the FDA, FSMA, PSR decision tree that I showed you earlier. And with that, I am at 11:34, and we can stop for, sorry, 12:34, and we can stop for questions.